Hey, it's me, Dave. I'm in hell. If you don't know, Mindy Kaling shot me in the face after I failed to give Velma a 10 out of 10 review. If you're interested to see my painful watch through of Velma, along with my eventual kidnapping and death, you can check out this playlist here. It's filled with a lot of fun. Now, being in hell kind of sucks. Everything's on fire, and it's just really not a great vacation destination, I have to say. But luckily for me, there's a way out. I managed to make a little deal with Lucifer. He said if I can suffer the worst torment known to man, I can escape. I can go back to the real world. And it turns out that the worst form of suffering is just more Velma. Who would have guessed?
My husband died.
So for your viewing pleasure or displeasure, depending on how you look at it, I'll actually be making 2 more videos on Velma. Whoa! There is a lot I could say about Velma, and I mean a lot. I could talk about it for hours with the amount of dog shit that's in that show. Like, wow. There's so much that I could say where it's to the point that it's hard for me not to go on 500 different tangents whenever this show gets brought up. To give an analogy, the show Velma is kind of like a large spider web. There's a metric ton of threads going in every which way. A bunch of different narrative strings that all interconnect with each other, support each other, and hold each other together. There are just so many problematic strands in this web that it's near impossible to get to one side or the other without getting stuck somewhere. It's a never-ending hellscape of silk. It's very hard for me to focus on one problem when it's connected to 40 other problems that are all screaming for attention. I want to talk about how Velma is terrible, but I also want to talk about how the other characters are terrible, but I also want to talk about how the plot is terrible. And then I want to talk about this, that, and the other thing until we've been drowned in the cacophony of terrible writing and bad decision making. But let's control ourselves, and let's stay laser focused on one specific aspect. But before that, let's talk about High Guardian Spice. You thought I forgot about it, didn't you? No, I'd still remember. I made a video not too long ago about a problem in High Guardian Spice, which was another problem I noticed in a lot of other media, and it's also in Velma as well, who would have guessed? I spent a lot of that video focusing on protagonist-centered morality, which is basically when the story tries to make the protagonist seem like a good guy when they really aren't. And a lot of people in the comments pointed that out, but that's not really what I was talking about. That's just a symptom of a much larger issue. Or I guess a better way of saying it is it's more like one type of the issue I was talking about, a form. The reason I focused on it so much is because it's the most common form, and it's also in Velma too, who would have guessed? Velma being treated like the good guy when they do terrible, terrible things all the time. But what I was really talking about in that video is when there's a conflict between what the story and writers want you to believe versus what's actually true. Like in the protagonist-centered morality example, there's 2 beliefs that are contradictory. One is that the protagonist is a good guy, the other is that they're bad. And these 2 points of view are both being pushed, even though they're completely contradictory. Usually this happens on accident, with the writer intending you to believe that the main character is a good person, but their actions in the story conflicting with that narrative completely. And that's what I was really talking about, the conflict between what the story is telling you and what the story is showing you. And before, I couldn't really find a term for this specifically. I mean, I looked for one, but it never showed up. Maybe I just missed it. One term people threw around a lot whenever I brought this up was ludonarrative dissonance, even though that doesn't work because ludonarrative dissonance is for video games. In that situation, there's a conflict between the story and gameplay, and if you don't realize, TV shows don't have gameplay, so they can't have ludonarrative dissonance. But after reading through a bunch of comments, I finally found one that gave me a term I liked. Narrative gaslighting. I fell in love with the term immediately because it sounds cool. Now this obviously comes from the term gaslighting, which can have a lot of different definitions depending on who you ask. But the one I'm most familiar with is trying to make a person think they're crazy through repeated lies. Whether that be lying about changes in their environment or lying about basic everyday things to try and make them think they're going insane. It's a tactic used to make someone think that they're crazy and just start accepting that they're always wrong about basic everyday things. And as a result, they're much easier to manipulate. But for narrative gaslighting, I'm going to apply my own little definition to it. Actually, let's give it 2 definitions, why not? Narrative gaslighting, when an author tries to convince the audience that a fact is true within a story when it's blatantly false. Or definition 2, when there is a conflict between what a story is telling the audience and what a story is showing the audience. Now, something important to notice about the first definition is it requires clear author intent. The person writing the story has to have a clear goal in mind that they're trying to get the audience to believe is true. However, the narrative that they've created actually conflicts with what they want the audience to believe. Now, the actual author intent and the intent of the story is very important here. Like, imagine, for instance, a story just has an unreliable narrator on purpose. The author intentionally made the narrator unreliable so the audience isn't supposed to believe in them. If an evil character acts like they're the good guy, you're not supposed to believe them because the author didn't intend you to. The reason the story isn't bad is because the narrative isn't really conflicting with itself. The narrative is doing exactly what it's supposed to. But imagine instead the character is supposed to be seen as a good guy, and the reason you can interpret them as being a horrible person is because the writer fucked up when writing the story. This can become a real problem if the story is predicated on you believing certain things to be true. But sometimes authorial intent can be hard to judge, and some people like to ignore it entirely, thinking the story can stand on its own. And I can't really say that's wrong. I guess it goes into separating the art from the artist, which is a whole other thing that I flip back and forth on all the time. But regardless of what my opinions on that are, I think there are some cases where it gets harder and harder to separate the art from the artist depending on what it is. Like if, I don't know, they were inserting themselves directly into the story, or pumping their own personal beliefs into every facet of it in the least subtle way possible. In that case, it might get a little harder to separate the two. But in that case, we have definition number 2, that being a conflict between what the story is telling us and what the story is showing us. Now, we all know the golden rule, show don't tell. You've heard that 100 times. But even worse than breaking that is doing both at the same time and doing them in contradictory ways. Now, again, whether or not this is actually a problem is largely a case-by-case thing, because sometimes the conflict between what characters are saying and what's actually being shown is made to be different on purpose. Again, for the sake of the story, it's done on purpose in various different ways. And again, on purpose. Like, for instance, maybe a character is just an idiot, but they're very famous because they get really lucky. And even though they talk a big game, we as the audience know that they aren't actually who they say they are. This is fine, but if it's done on accident, then it becomes a problem. Now you end up with a character who's supposed to be intelligent and not supposed to be a complete idiot, and everyone treats them like they're not a complete idiot, but they are a complete idiot. And now suddenly we feel like we're in two contradictory points in reality. The math isn't adding up. Something just isn't right. You see, a story
is like an enormous clock.
Yes, precisely. You see, the story works at its best if all the little cogs mesh together. Now, of course, a clock needs to be cleaned, well lubricated, and wound tight. Some of the best clocks have dual movements cogs that fit, that work together by design. All of the cogs or elements of the story work together to push the narrative forward. But what happens if one of these cogs doesn't want to work with the rest? Maybe the cog doesn't quite fit, maybe it's too big or too small, or maybe it wants to rotate in a completely different direction to where it's supposed to be going. Well, now multiple pieces of the clock are fighting with each other. One wants to go one way, the other wants to go the other way, and everything's falling apart. The clock will start to malfunction because its inner pieces are rotating the wrong way or working in ways they shouldn't be, and as a result, the clock doesn't work right. And that's why this is such a huge problem. If one of the key concepts of the story that the audience is supposed to believe just flat out isn't true when you look at it, it causes the narrative not to work. But now you may be wondering, what does this have to do with Velma? Well, don't worry, we'll get there.
Don't you want any tips on selling?
I think I got it. Drugs are like crack to these people.
Let's cut right to the chase. Velma is a complete dumbass throughout the entire series. She's just an idiot. She's not very bright, she makes dumb decisions all the time, and she just isn't good at being a detective. The only times in the series where Velma makes an advancement on the mystery is when someone else is doing the work for her, or if she just happens to stumble into the correct answers. So solving the mystery, the main thing she's supposed to be doing, is something that doesn't happen because she does any work. It's because other people do all of it for her, or she just gets super lucky. There are multiple points in the story where they act like Velma is the only one doing anything, like such as the festival episode where everyone thinks the killer is a ghost and gives up on solving the mystery. And of course, Velma starts bitching about it in her typical fashion, complaining about how she's the only one trying to find her missing mom, despite the fact that most of the leads she gets come from other people. Hell, Fred, the character the writers made to be a complete moron, is better at finding clues to the mystery than Velma is.
There were some papers in Father's special drawer where he keeps his men's workout magazines. Turns out our house used to be owned by a woman named Dr. Edna Purdue.
Now, if this was intentional and Velma was just made to be an idiot from the start who just gets really lucky, then this would be fine, but it's not intentional. The writers actively want you to believe that Velma is a good mystery solver and is actually smart.
Look, I know you're a genius.
Thank you.
For all your personality flaws, you're actually a pretty good detective.
Not only is there dialogue like this peppered throughout the show, but people behind the show such as Mindy were calling Velma brilliant and super smart behind the scenes. It's very obvious they intended Velma to be intelligent and an at least somewhat decent detective. But no matter how hard the story wants to lie to you, Velma isn't a good detective and she's not smart at all. So here we have our first instance of narrative gaslighting, the writers wanting us to believe that Velma is a good detective when she's blatantly not. But even if Velma was a great detective, the one mystery that she could never solve is what the hell these writers were smoking when they made this. Velma is so poorly written that it almost seems to be on purpose. And there's a part of me that thinks maybe it was. Maybe the reason Velma acts like a dumbass all the time is because it's just for dumb jokes that they wanted to shove into each scene. Having characters suddenly lose all their brain cells for the sake of making fun of them is a common trope nowadays. But the reason Velma feels so awkward and poorly written is because she's trying to be multiple different people at once. She's trying to be both the smart and witty detective and the clumsy dumbass archetypes at the same time, and it just doesn't work. Now listen, I'm not saying that smart characters can't make mistakes or be a little stupid from time to time. Nobody's perfect. It's reasonable for smart characters to mess up from time to time. Even in real life, smart people sometimes make dumb decisions. Like maybe on some occasions they get over-emotional and their feelings get the better of them, or maybe they're just very anxious and they're put in a situation where they don't have time to think straight. Smart characters don't have to be smart all the time, but Velma just isn't smart at any time. I'm willing to bet pretty much every lead or smart thing Velma does is either A, due to happenstance, B, due to someone else doing the work for her, or C, it's just brain-dead obvious to begin with. Velma just outright lacks the character traits that are required for a good detective. She jumps to conclusions constantly throughout the series, and the second she has her mind on something, she refuses to admit she's wrong until there's literally enough evidence dumped on her to snap her in half. It's not even a matter of her being skeptical, she's just so stubborn and dense that her head has enough mass to rip apart 100 neutron stars. She immediately assumes that Fred is the serial killer because, and I quote, he's white and has a tiny dong, and she's constantly just judging people on superficial factors and jumping to the first conclusion that comes to mind. And what proves to me that the writers weren't actually self-aware enough to catch on to this is the fact that later on in the series, she starts judging people for jumping to conclusions.
Huh? Nothing added up, and yet no one seemed to care.
You don't seem to care when your theories don't add up, Velma, but yeah, let's act like everyone else is the problem. The reason Velma acts the way she does is because she's a textbook narcissist. She thinks she's better and smarter than everyone around her, so the second she comes to a conclusion, she's gotta stick to it, or else she might have to admit that she's actually a dumbass.
What? Are you crazy? Finding Fred innocent would require me to admit I'd incorrectly prejudged someone. Wait. Yeah, no, I was right. Home Slice is like Robert Durst level guilty.
That right there, what you just watched, is another thing that pisses me off about this show to no end, and that's fake-out character development. That is another form of narrative gaslighting that's pretty common, pretending a character is going through a character arc when really they're staying the same person the whole way through. There are so many scenes in this show where they pretend like Velma is actually about to learn a lesson or improve, only for it to immediately seconds later be cut off by her being an asshole again. Velma does not improve or grow throughout the show. She starts the story as an asshole and she ends the story as an asshole. This is not a redemption arc story. Velma doesn't learn any hard lessons or become better. She's just an idiot who gets everything she wants because the writers want her to. The only redemption arc I see here is HBO Max canceling Velma Season 2 and then publicly apologizing for unleashing this war crime of a show. Just to prove that Velma is still the same asshole at the start of the story as she is at the end, one of the last things that Velma does in the show is twerk over the dead body of Fred's mother while Fred is covered in her blood. Fred's mom was fucking exploded right in front of Fred's eyes. The entire group is traumatized, and the first thing Velma does is jerk herself off for solving the mystery and then twerk over a fucking dead body! Alright, listen, I don't think anyone deserves to be harassed because of bad writing. Being an asshole to people online is not going to improve anything, and it's just going to create a cycle of hatred that's going to make everything worse. We all make mistakes and nothing we do is perfect, so we need to work together to help improve ourselves so that we can be better in the future. All that being said, the person who wrote that deserves to be cast into the pits of Tartarus for all eternity. Makes me wonder why I'm the one who gets stuck in hell when there's shit like this in the real world. Where was I? Oh right, there's narrative gaslighting going on here. The show wants you to believe that Velma is actually a good detective and is smart when she's an idiot and a terrible detective. I actually saw a comment recently which points out one of the scenes that shows Velma is a terrible detective.
Why don't the boys have to take a don't murder girls class?
In that scene right there, Velma proposes jokingly that the solution to the serial killer problem is to have boys take a don't murder girls class, automatically assuming that the serial killer is a guy. But if you actually watch to the end of the series, the serial killer was a woman. Velma was just wrong. She automatically assumed the killer's traits based off of superficial factors. It's funny how a show that encourages its audience to not believe in stereotypes or judge people for surface-level details is also a show that stars one of the most judgmental and bigoted characters I've seen in a long time. And to show you how fucked up the character writing in this show is, there's a character trait that Velma has that I think was entirely unintentional. And despite that, it's one of the most consistent traits she has throughout the entire series. Velma has a hate fetish. No, I'm serious. Velma isn't just hated by people, she needs hate from people. You see, the authors have been so preoccupied into gaslighting the audience to think that Velma is actually a bullied girl who really is just misunderstood, but in reality, she's not. And the idea that Velma is actively trying to get everyone around her to hate her because she likes being hated actually explains pretty much everything she does throughout the entire series. Seriously, think about it. Actually, let me show you some examples of what I mean. Prior to episode 4, Velma had a huge crush on Fred, and at the end of episode 4, Fred actually comes over to Velma's house. Fred tells Velma that he's actually in love with her, but suddenly something changes and Velma just isn't into Fred at all anymore. Now, the on-screen graphics tell us that Velma doesn't like him anymore because she equated him to being problematic due to being a dickhead. On the outside, he may be popular and handsome, but on the inside, he's a bad person. But I have a question for you. Why is Velma coming to this conclusion now? Based on some of the things she said about Fred beforehand, she would have already believed this from the get-go. Now they're trying to narrative gaslight here and make it look like Velma is having a different perspective from before, but her perspective is exactly the same. So if a change in perspective isn't really what made Velma not like Fred anymore, what did it? The only thing that changed is that Fred actually likes Velma now. He's showing her affection, and the second he does that, Velma does not like him at all anymore. Because Velma only liked Fred so long as Fred was shitting on her. The second he stops, she no longer likes him. And this carries over to pretty much every relationship she has throughout the series. Like for instance with Daphne, who Velma is head over heels for whenever she's being mean to her. The only times Velma actually focuses on Daphne is when Daphne is ignoring her or just being rude. Whenever Daphne and Velma start becoming friends again, Velma suddenly starts ignoring and putting her off.
I may have found my real
You haven't
parents.
seen Norville, have you? He's like the only dork in town not inside my house.
No, but
Hobbits, do not use that plunger as a mute. That's how Ebola happened.
Velma, wait.
Or what about Norville, someone Velma gives no fucks about and treats like a tool throughout the entire series? That is, until the last episode when Norville hates her. The second Norville starts treating Velma like the piece of shit she is the moment that she immediately falls in love with him. To put it simply, Velma just wants people to hate her, which is why she acts like a prick at all times. Now again, I don't think the writers intended for her to have this trait. Maybe I'm wrong, but from the looks of things, it seems to be completely on accident. Maybe the real reason Velma is like this is because she's a self-insert for Mindy, and Mindy has a hate fetish, which is why she made the show. Oh man, I got a weird cough. I don't know what happened there. But you're probably asking, why does all of this matter? Why does the story details conflicting with themselves mean Velma's a bad show? Well, I'll tell you.
My milkshake brings all the boys to the yard, and they're like,
So there's an important question that needs to be asked, and that's why the story is written this way. When it comes to stories that feature narrative gaslighting, there's usually 3 reasons as to why. The first one is that the story writers were just lazy. It's way easier to lie about something than to actually do it right. For instance, if you wanted to create an intelligent mystery solver, you could have them slowly putting the pieces together, using the evidence and making logical conclusions, and just have them show off how smart they are in general, but that might take some effort. Instead, you could have them solve everything by mere happenstance or off-screen and then have all the characters talk about how smart they are. That's just way easier, and we all know taking the shortcut route is always the optimal solution. The other reason narrative gaslighting happens is when people are not certain on what they want their story or characters to be like beforehand and end up doing multiple things at once even if they don't work together. Sure, my character is supposed to be a good guy, but I want them to do this evil thing in this scene because I think it would be really cool. No, it's not building up to anything or part of the narrative, I just want them to do it because I like it. And the third reason is by far the most common: the writers were just stupid. And yes, I do mean that in an insulting way. If the writers feel fine insulting their own viewers and fans in their own show, then why should I not feel fine doing it to the writers themselves? If you can't take it, then don't dish it out. Okay, I knew I said I didn't want to be too mean to them, but like, can you blame me? Look at what I'm dealing with here. But again, why does any of this matter? Well, with all the narrative gaslighting surrounding Velma, the writers have actually fucked up her character in a way that completely ruins the main themes of the story. Let me show you a clip from the last episode that explains what I mean by that.
Exactly. I am so sick of rich guys like you, not only not realizing how much is handed to them, but still thinking they're the victims when they mess everything up because of their lazy entitlement and fragile egos.
You did this!
No, Fred! I only said those things to rile you up! I mean, yes, I feel that way, but...
So the stuff Velma said in that scene basically explains the main themes of this story. The main villain wanted to replace Fred's brain because Fred was an entitled rich white guy with a tiny dong. And this show aims to criticize people like Fred who are in positions of power but don't realize just how much they have. And this idea is what motivates both the main villain and Velma herself to a certain extent. So why don't we write down the traits that Velma is trying to criticize? So here's the list of traits that Velma views as problematic, not appreciating what you have, being lazy and entitled, having a fragile ego, and taking credit from people who deserve it more. So these are all the things that Velma as a show is criticizing. Now I have to ask, do we know anyone else who has any of these 3 traits, maybe all of them? Velma. Velma demonstrates every trait that this show views as problematic. She gets pretty much anything and everything handed to her with very little effort. She doesn't appreciate the things or friends that she has. She constantly ignores, belittles, and tosses aside her friends even when they're actively trying to help her. And she just sits back as other people solve the mystery for her and then takes all the credit at the end. And to top it off, she's an entitled prick who acts like an asshole to everyone she meets. She's a terrible, poorly written character who doesn't even learn anything at the end of the story. And before anyone comes in and says they were going to have her have character development in Season 2, fuck off. First of all, the idea that anyone's going to watch Season 2 is the biggest joke I've heard all year. And the fact that a Season 2 is even happening is just utterly baffling. But even if Season 2 is the best show ever made, it still wouldn't be able to fix this clusterfuck. Anyway, what I'm trying to say with this video is that narrative gaslighting can completely ruin a story. It can cause it to contradict itself all over the place. It can lead to confusion and make a show feel like an utter fever dream. And if done frequently enough, it can serve to undermine some of the main themes of the story. Velma's not the only show that does this, but it sure does do it a lot. The examples I gave mostly revolve around Velma as a character, but there are so many other things in this show that are narrative gaslighting. If you want to identify narrative gaslighting for yourself, actually take the time to critically think about what's happening on screen. But that will end part 1 of my Velma analysis. Part 2 is going to focus more around the discussion surrounding the show rather than the show itself. I don't like to do that, as I like to stay focused more on the shows themselves, but I feel like it's necessary in this case, so be on the lookout for that. But speaking of narrative gaslighting, I'm going to end this video in a proper manner that doesn't involve me just suddenly getting cut off.